Awesome. We're live, Jacob. Here we go. So
Awesome.
thanks
Get
everyone for
into it.
joining. We're going to dive into a pretty exciting topic today about how to build a DTC forecast. This is coming from both the perspective on the finance and marketing side. So Jacob, looking very much forward to talking about this. I would love to give you the chance to introduce yourself here before we get started. So maybe take it away, Jacob, and then we'll dive in.
Awesome. Yeah, let's do it. Hey everyone, I'm Jacob Paddock. I'm one of the co-founders at Allen and the founding partner at Aplo Group. So today, looking forward to going through a D2C forecast.
Awesome. Yeah. So quick intro on myself as well. One of the founding partners at Aplo Group. So on the Aplo Group side, we're a direct consumer growth marketing firm. We work with scaling brands typically between 5 to 75, 80 million per year on the DTC side. And then Alan is a demand planning and inventory forecasting tool that we developed internally at Aplo. So we'll be speaking a little bit about that at the end of the presentation. But the primary goal of today is really diving into how scaling eight-figure DTC brands forecast and not only how to build that forecast and what components are important within it, but really the foundations of using that forecast as a strategic lever for growth across the marketing and finance side, but really focusing on how we use that forecast to actually make better scaling decisions, set better KPIs on the paid advertising side, the email and SMS front, and really kind of coordinate everything across the board there. So looking forward to diving into it. If this is something that you're not doing currently, then this is going to be very valuable for you to understand how to actually kind of initially set this up. If it is something that you're already executing at your brand, ideally this gives you a bit more context to potentially ways you can do it better or different ways that you can actually use that information. So on the agenda side, four things that we're going to be covering today. We'll look at the forecasting framework. So really just kind of defining the different components that go into the forecast, why they're important, why they're used. We won't spend a lot of time on that. We'll just really quickly go through what are all the components that are included in this forecast. We'll then talk about the what we call revenue anatomy. So really kind of pulling apart revenue into two cohorts, new versus returning customer revenue, and why that's so important as it pertains to developing the forecast and making decisions thereafter. We'll then talk about the decision engine. So once we have an understanding of kind of the forecasting framework, the different components of the revenue pie, we're going to talk about how we actually make decisions from that initial forecast, specifically on the contribution margin target and efficiency side. So we'll get into a bit of that there as we go through that section. And then lastly, we'll wrap it up pretty quickly with operationalizing the plan. So basically using that forecast to then make adjustments to your strategy, reference your pacing versus your target or your forecast, and really operationalizing the decision-making framework after you've built the initial forecast. So exciting stuff to dive into. Jacob, anything there before we keep going or all good on
No,
your end?
let's jump into it. Let's jump into forecasting framework.
Sure. Awesome. So first section is the forecasting framework. So it's a pretty busy slide here that you see. What we're going to be talking about initially is really kind of if you're doing this from a static spreadsheet standpoint, kind of how you would look at constructing that. We'll then talk about some more automated ways to do it that are a bit more robust. But what you're seeing here on the right is what a typical forecast will look like for a D2C brand when we're basically breaking everything apart between new and return customer revenue. Here you can see that we're basically looking at a November forecast. We have the actuals for October, everything throughout the year there, and kind of what we're expecting to see in November and December. So really in that kind of peak Q4 moment as an example. And you'll see all the line items here that we're breaking out between the new and return customer side. So I'll very briefly hand it over to Jacob if you kind of want to go through some of the components here very briefly, and then we'll continue on.
Yeah, totally. So on the left-hand side, these are all the terms that we're going to be using kind of interchangeably throughout the presentation. So there's going to be a lot of reference to kind of each of these, and we'll go through these in more detail throughout the call. But on the right-hand side, this is a variable costed P&L that we build that essentially, it shows not only the P&L level metrics, but also the components and the pacing that kind of create this variable costed P&L. Everything is bifurcated into new and returning customer fields from revenue down to contribution margin, which we'll jump into in later slides just to go through why that's
Yeah.
important for target setting, et cetera. But very briefly here, AMR, so we're looking at acquisition efficiency essentially. Ad spend, of course, is ad spend. Items per order, this is an important KPI for quantity forecasting. AOV, retention rates, discount rates, return or refund rates, shipping revenue, logistics, cost of goods. We have contribution margin and fixed costs. So these are all terms that we'll be kind of using interchangeably, and we'll be kind of going back and forth on all of these throughout the presentation. If we jump into revenue anatomy, which is the next slide here, this is where we're looking, as
Mhm.
mentioned, at basically these two kind of types of customers. We have new and returning customers, and these are forecasted fundamentally differently in terms of how we come up with the premise for what new and returning customer
Absolutely.
is. So, as mentioned, these are two vastly different cohorts, and oftentimes these cohorts can have vastly different behaviors. So, the average order value of new customers, for example, or how many items they purchase per first order versus returning order can be very different. So, whether you're forecasting a demand plan or you're forecasting a P&L level or a variable costed P&L, it has tremendous impact not only on the revenue profile of the actual business, but also what the contribution margin is based on what the type of product they're purchasing, how many of those products they're purchasing, what the AOV is of those different customers, and so on. And we'll get into this in later slides as mentioned, but at kind of like a high level, we're always looking, is it a new customer or a returning customer, and always bifurcating the two. So before we move on,
Absolutely.
Liam, is there anything you want to add here on
Yeah.
the slide?
No, I mean, I think you hit on pretty much everything there. I think one thing that people often get kind of mistaken on the forecasting side, or even just predicting performance, is they really look at revenue as kind of at an aggregate level, and they don't bifurcate it, to your point, Jacob, between new and return customer revenue. And as you mentioned, we'll get into more of the specifics of why this is so important in the upcoming slides. But you have not only vastly different profiles between these two cohorts of revenue, but one's much more predictable than the other. And if you're just looking at it as at kind of an aggregate level, you're going to be missing a lot of opportunity across the board to potentially push more aggressively, or potentially you need to be a bit more conservative on certain channels in order to meet your KPIs. So incredibly important to bifurcate these two. I think just jumping into the next slide here on the new customer revenue side. So for most brands in the space, this is kind of what you could kind of quote unquote call the gas pedal. It's primarily driven by paid acquisition channels like paid social, paid search. If you know you're completely organic as a brand and you're growing entirely organic, hats off to you. Amazing spot to be in. But most brands are not in that situation where paid is the vast majority of their new customer demand creation, and you're going to have much slimmer margin on the new customer side than the return customer side. So when you begin forecasting, as we showed in the earlier slide, having the new customer revenue side broken out is incredibly important across all the different components that Jacob you went through. And I guess on the key lever side, Jacob, curious your thoughts here, but specifically on the AOV and discount rate side, how that directly impacts kind of what you can call the quality of new customers being acquired, and how that subsequently impacts the economics of that funnel. So curious your thoughts there, and kind of what you'd like to dive into on that piece.
Yeah, this is almost the point on like engineering the perfect offer, right? And different sort of products have different offers that are kind of more, they kind of fit better, let's say, especially from a new customer perspective. Some brands, for example, depending on the category, they might have like a very core sort of welcome offer that has multiple sort of complementary products together, high discount associated with those. The AOV is maybe higher, but the perceived value is also higher because maybe you can afford at that average order value to also give away 30% or something like that on a really attractive new customer offer. In another case, for example, you might acquire customers through something that's a bit more like 10%, 15% off, with a more sort of like subscription-based funnel where you're getting 10% off if you subscribe and save, or you're getting 15% off if you subscribe and save with a certain quantity. And, some brands typically top out at like 20, 25, 30%. 30% is rare. You'd have to be ordering a lot. And then in some cases, it's more just a standard sort of discount. You have seasonal moments, you have maybe a site-wide sale or an up-to sale. And those are things
Mhm.
that, will ultimately impact the type of new customer acquisition you can do, the efficiency at which you can do that acquisition. And it's always really engineering what that offer is between the AOV, the efficiency you can drive, what you can spend against that efficiency, and then ultimately the contribution margin you can drive from that offer. One thing I want to double click on, because you mentioned this earlier,
Yep.
and this is like, if there's like one major takeaway from this entire presentation, it's you need to be bifurcating new and returning customer revenue kind of always in your modeling, because a lot of brands will run at like a very slim to almost break even contribution margin on the new customer side, just given the combination of unit economics and efficiency on the kind of paid acquisition side. Since, to your point, most brands are predominantly paid social, paid search, the acquisition
Yep.
cost associated with that and then kind of new customer contribution margin, it can be driven again, unless your volume is massive, like, and even when the volume is massive, it's a slim margin compared to the returning customer revenue contribution margin that's typically driven from those customers that are coming back over 90 days, 180 days, 360 days, and beyond. So I just want to really
Absolutely.
double click on that point. How you engineer those acquisition offers is one thing, But also keep in mind there's an LTV component, right? Because how many customers you're acquiring and what offer they're kind of being acquired with will then have impact on product affinity and what their LTV expectations are and all these different things that you want to model out, which we'll get into in later slides too. But and it's just so I just really want to stress like it has to be always bifurcated so that these two customer types are considered and how you're building offers for those customers and how you're acquiring those customers, all of that, it all works together. So just want to make that super clear.
Absolutely. And one thing also just to highlight on there, Jacob, that you mentioned, just on the topic of AOV and discount rate, I think one thing that, again, just to your point about bifurcating those two kind of cohorts of revenue, you'll often have different discount rates associated with new and return customer sales because of the offers that you're running, and that's going to vastly impact those two cohorts of revenue. So again, using blanket discount rate here is not going to give you an accurate picture of the contribution margin dollars you're generating on both the new and return customer side, which is going to then trickle down to impacting how you go about spend targets, how aggressive you can be on the ad side versus what you're doing on the return customer side. Because I think pretty much everybody here is likely running some sort of new customer offer that might be more aggressive, and in many cases it should be more aggressive than what you're giving to return customers on the back end. So that discount rate profile is going to be vastly different between those two cohorts of revenue. So very important to look at it that way.
100%. And one example of this is like, let's say you sell like a durable sort of product and there's some consumable nature to it. Like the product itself
Yeah,
is durable and doesn't need to actually be replaced, but there's a component to it that needs to be replenished. Maybe it's a filter, or maybe it's, something like that, an ingredient that goes into that initial product. Typically, those on the new customer side, that offer will look very different than the returning customer side because the returning customer is not coming back to buy the same product they bought again, but they
exactly.
are buying complementary products so that they can use the product they initially bought with. So that's where sort of these welcome offers or these like initial bundles, and this is where kind of goes back to that point of like engineering your perfect acquisition offer and then planning kind of subsequent kind of repurchase offers that it really comes into play. And again, this is where
Yeah.
your items per order comes into play, AOV. And to your point, like the discount profile of those two customer types is very different because again, even the products they're buying are completely different, even though it's like all
Exactly.
kind of consistent with that initial purchase.
And you hit on one really good point there, Jacob. I think we'll save this for maybe a couple slides in the future. But you brought up offers and just kind of offer testing if you're running a new offer. I think one thing people often struggle with, and I'm sure many of you watching might have this situation arise over and over again, is when you are testing a new offer on the acquisition side, how do you actually model that appropriately in your forecasting work that you're doing? So I think we'll touch on that soon and kind of how you can overlay the new customer and return customer behavior with new offers you're running, and just to kind of get a better sense of, is this offer an actual viable one for me to scale before you start accumulating a lot of that LTV data. So we'll kind of touch on that, but you just brought up a good point that I think is going to be good to kind of share as we go through this. But to wrap the new customer revenue side up, we've kind of hit on this a few times, but another key concept to understand is that it's going to be way less forecastable compared to return customer revenue. So expect higher fluctuations in your new customer revenue forecasts. The return customer piece is the easiest one to forecast because it's much more consistent through the cohort data that you have. And you don't really have any sort of fluctuating ad costs associated with what you're expecting to see from that cohort of revenue. So very important concept there. Jumping in the return customer revenue. So we kind of call this the piggy bank. You can look at it in that way. It is where you drive your high margin revenue. It's primarily driven through own channels like email and SMS. And I think it's an important concept to functionally think of. Your return customer contribution margin is really what covers your costs predictably over time. So, Jake, on the predictability side, do you want to speak maybe a little bit to your perspective on return customer revenue and why it's so predictable through proper cohort modeling and cohort data?
Yeah, I'm glad you said predictability because that's the word that when I look at this screen, it's like the most important word on this entire
Yeah,
slide. And it kind of like to zoom out a little bit, why is predictability important? It's because on the new customer side, if you have no returning customer revenue, you're at a very high risk place where if acquisition metrics go sideways for a quarter, for
exactly.
example, you basically don't have the ability to spend against that inefficiency potentially. And that means that not only if you were already driving slim kind of contribution margin, you may be not driving any contribution margin at a break even in a break even situation and not actually creating any excess contribution margin dollars that you need to cover fixed overhead kind of down the P&L. So predictability is really, really important. It varies based on sort of what the kind of propensity to come back and buy is for each sort of business, each category. Some businesses have a phenomenal LTV built into them just due to the nature of the product. It's a consumable good,
Mhm.
for example. If the customers like what the product is and have a kind of daily sort of use case to it, or there's some sort of ritual around it, it makes a lot of sense why the LTV for a brand like that is stronger than, for example, a brand that has a very a very high price point, one time kind of purchase. The most extreme example of this is like compare the LTV of a mattress customer versus a customer of like a supplement, for example, like completely
Yep.
different buying patterns and frequency, et cetera. But going back to predictability, why does predictability matter? If you have a very kind of hard to forecast and sort of unpredictable efficiency model that you're running on the new customer side, it's hard to actually build in like a baseline expectation on what contribution margin is going to look like. If, for example, things went sideways on the new customer side. So another example of this,
Yep.
let's say for whatever reason, it just stopped making sense for you to acquire new customers at a certain efficiency. Maybe you need to rethink offer. Maybe you do need to pull back spend. Maybe it actually just doesn't make sense to acquire customers for a moment in time. If that ever were to take place, that obviously will have a lasting impact on the P&L in future months and in future cohorts because you stop acquiring new customers. And obviously, those customers, if they don't exist, can't come back as returning customers in future months. But
Mhm.
depending on the size of the number of customers that are kind of in activation, so they're active, they've bought recently, they're kind of still within that retention curve, you can actually ride out that sort of period for,
It's a
and again,
cushion.
it
It's a
depends
cushion of
on
sorts.
the
Yeah.
brand, but
Yeah.
depending on the size of that cohort, you can actually ride that out with very high contribution margin revenue. And again, it'll catch up with you. If you stop acquiring new customers, you will eventually run out of the piggy bank, so to speak, will eventually run out of coins. But you do have a little bit more safety built in. And the predictability piece, I think, plays a large role in that. I'll say one last thing before we kind of move on. I would say the predictability also comes from the nature of the forecasting itself. On the new customer side, we're looking at AMR and spend. So we're looking at some predicted efficiency, modeling multiple scenarios across what new customer expectations are based on what we expect efficiency to look like and spend targets against contribution margin, et cetera. On the returning customer side, however, we're looking at it from a customer cohort perspective. So we have some LTV and some retention rate modeled in that we can expect within, some amount of error and some amount of variability that these customers will come back at a fairly predictable rate. And the older your business and the
Mhm.
more proven your offer, the more you can actually count on that predictable revenue to come back. So, and again, all of that kind of comes back as also very high margin revenue as well, because you're not necessarily recapturing that customer through a paid channel. That's not to say that you don't have some customers that are returning customers seeing ads, and there's always going to be some slippage of sales. But generally speaking, especially in this model, if it's a returning customer within that sort of like activation period, you can count those customers as essentially high contribution margin, as a very high contribution margin cohort for you. So yeah, just
Mhm.
wanted to touch on those few things here for returning customers.
Yeah, no, you hit on a lot of good stuff there. The one thing I think that's very important to understand and kind of pay attention to is the last point here where we talk about tracking return customer contribution margin dollars, not just revenue. And I think a lot of people get mixed up when they look at CAC to LTV and they're analyzing the return customer revenue cohort data, and they're just looking at revenue, but not the actual contribution margin dollars that are generated from that cohort of revenue, because that's what you actually need to cover your expenses and have an accurate picture of what that return customer pie of revenue is actually doing for you. So very important piece there just to break out. And that's again why the exercise of forecasting is so important, is to actually pull that apart. Um, Next section here is the decision engine. So basically setting efficiency targets that drive profit, and really how do you actually use the forecast that you've built to start setting targets across the board. So the main one that we look at, and arguably the single most important metric for most D2C brands, is really contribution margin. And contribution margin not only as a kind of aggregate sum, but also between new and return customer revenue. I think again, what's very important to understand how hard you can actually push on the new customer side is understanding the contribution margin dollars generated from return customers or new customers and return customers. Because, for example, let's say you're barely generating any on the new customer side, but you're generating a sizable amount on the return customer side. That is effectively subsidizing your acquisition strategy, and you might be able to push more aggressively and that funnel might make sense. You might, if you look at it kind of, with a tunnel vision and only analyzing the new customer side without taking into consideration what you're expecting from the return customer contribution margin side of things, you're not going to get an accurate picture of how aggressive you actually might be able to push spend on any given month due to the nature of, again, that bifurcation. So, Jacob, anything that you want to share on the contribution margin side?
Yeah, I think that just looking at contribution minus fixed cost is like a
Yep.
framework. It's an easy, it's a quick way to understand like what level of fixed cost can my business support on a just purely like contribution margin sort of basis. So if you know your new customer acquisition is slim margin or kind of break even, but you have a certain sort of returning customer base, you sort of know what your like sort of safety level is in terms of contribution margin. Because again, it goes back to that profitability discussion of like, if you can profitably
Hmm.
forecast that returning customer contribution margin is going to be X, well, then you can also then make spend decisions and acquisition decisions against against that, knowing that, well, I need this amount to support my business from a fixed cost perspective. Can I get there on just returning customer contribution margin, or how much contribution margin do I need to generate, excuse me, across both new customers, returning customers? So you can start to actually model these scenarios and understand, like, if X takes place on the new customer side, what is going to be my total contribution margin, and how does that support the business kind of overhead that, I've committed to, the all the other associated sort of costs, as well as, I'll add one last thing. The one framing that I like to use a lot is the intrinsic growth rate of your business is basically pegged to what your kind of LTV velocity is. So the faster
Yep.
that your customers are kind of coming back and buying from you, the quicker you are creating free cash flow from those customers that you're acquiring, which means that
Exactly.
if you have, for example, no external financing, the rate at which you can grow and finance inventory purchases, et cetera, it's kind of a function of that LTV increase. So it's if your LTV growth is 100% in 90 days versus 365 days, you actually you're in a much better position to extract more value, more free cash flow out of that customer faster than if you had to wait a whole year, for example. And again, that has
100%.
implications on what the kind of working capital inside the business looks like and how quickly you can reinvest that capital into growth, or just create essentially more free cash flow in the business to, basically pay out as dividends to shareholders, kind of have more profit on the books, et cetera. So very kind of I'd say abstract concept, but that's one that I like to kind of always go back to. Like, the better your LTV, and specifically the faster the rate at which that LTV gets realized, the more free cash flow you have to reinvest back into growing the business. And oftentimes we see the businesses that tend to grow the fastest and support that and do that profitably are the ones that figure out this acquisition funnel where you have this like really, really healthy velocity of LTV, rather than just looking at it as like this is all out like LTV over all time. Because all time could mean a
Yep.
lot of things. It can mean 5 years, it can mean,
Exactly.
5 months. So really important just
Exactly. And
look at that.
yeah, and effectively what you're getting at is, again, just providing more cushion on a shorter period of time to then reinvest into the flywheel on the acquisition side more aggressively, which also can allow you to drop your targets or I mean, I guess you could say increase your CAC targets, or kind of threshold on the paid acquisition side on a shorter period of time because of that, cohort of return customer revenue that's coming through. Um, I think we're good on that side. In terms of the subsidization model, excuse me, I think you kind of almost alluded to it briefly there, Jacob. And I think we've talked about it a bit going through this presentation, but there's really there's a few ways to look at this, and very simply, you can be a brand with very little return customer revenue and very little LTV increase after acquiring a customer, or you can be a brand with a pretty significant increase in the actual value of a customer after you've acquired them. And what that means is on the acquisition side. So for some brands, it can be a positive funnel to acquire new customers at a loss or break even, low contribution margin to fuel future return customer revenue. But again, going back to the whole kind of theme of this conversation, if you're not modeling those two cohorts of revenue, you're not going to have a clear picture into how aggressive you can actually push and how low you can bring that target on the ad side, and how aggressive you can push there without modeling those two accordingly. Um, and basically, what happens here in the subsidization model is the high contribution margin dollars from return customers and also that active growing customer base subsidize the cost of new customer acquisition. And I think what's really, really key here from a forecasting standpoint to grasp is understanding the and modeling how your active customer base actually grows over time, and then the resulting contribution margin dollars that is generated from that growing active customer base. That is a hugely important concept to model out. I'll give you an example of this, and we see this quite a lot actually, Jacob. Let's say in January of this year, you're a food and beverage, or not food and beverage, I should say more of like a health and wellness company, and it's a very big time of the year for you. So you're making a massive push on acquisition. You're kind of flooding bringing in a lot of new customer revenue. A lot of new customers are coming in during that period of time. And let's say you're a business that after 2 to 3 months, or on the third month after you've acquired a customer, the value of that cohort really spikes aggressively, and you expect a lot of positive contribution margin dollars coming from that cohort that you acquired very aggressively 3 months ago. If you don't model this out correctly, and you just kind of go through it as business as usual with no forecasting exercise, you're gonna miss seeing that huge cohort of revenue come through. And what that's going to result in is you're going to miss a huge opportunity to potentially push even more aggressive on acquisition during that month, because of the amount of contribution margin dollars that are being generated from that return customer cohort that's coming through from the previous acquisition push. So that gets in again to everything from a marketing strategy standpoint, both on the paid acquisition side and the email and SMS and return customer side. It'll give you a bit more breathing room to be much more aggressive during that time of year, during that month when you expect to see that big cohort come through. So again, we kind of touched on this theme many times, but a hugely important piece to do is understand your active customer base, and also ensure that you're not acquiring new customers at a rate that's slower than you actually losing active customers, because over time, that basically results in your business shrinking and going the opposite direction that you likely want it to go. So very important concept there. Jake, I'll pass it over to you if you want to touch on anything here as well. But I think that's, again, hugely important and often overlooked.
No, I think that's really well said. I'll just add that we've worked with over 100 brands across like clothing, apparel, CPG, pet, etc. And like it's more common than it is not, that basically this is the situation most brands find themselves. There's like a very slim to, and it's just the math of it. Like the acquisition metrics will be less profitable than the returning customer metrics. So from a contribution margin standpoint, you just absolutely need to model these two cohorts separately so that you can make decisions if you're running a strategy where part of your returning customer revenue is actually subsidizing the acquisition on the new customer side. So just
Yep.
kind of echoing what you said, like it's incredibly important. And again, if there's one takeaway from this entire presentation, like bifurcate the two cohorts, look at new and look at returning customers, model those two obviously together, but make sure that you are looking at them as separate. Because again, I don't want to drive the impression that like these are completely unrelated. New customer acquisition ends up becoming future returning customer revenue. So you have to model them together. But in terms of how you look at it, kind of within your forecasting period, it's incredibly important that you understand this is the returning customer revenue that's coming in. This is the new customer revenue that's coming in. And more importantly, the contribution margin driven by each of those, and then what that actually kind of totals to.
Exactly. Absolutely. So we're running short on time here, so we'll go through the operationalizing the plan fairly quickly. There's two main things I think that's worth touching on here, Jacob. The first one, and I think this is kind of a never-ending debate, because you have people that are very fixated on kind of the two extremes here. But when you have a forecast, obviously, I'll backtrack here. The goal of the forecast is obviously to give you directional information about what you expect to have happen, a base case, upside, downside scenario, and kind of plan accordingly for all of those outcomes. But the one thing I'm curious your thoughts actually, Jake, on this, in terms of your pacing against the forecast and fluctuations on a daily, weekly basis, et cetera, monthly even. Let's start on kind of a monthly basis. How how frequently do you feel that you should be referencing your pacing against that forecast, and then subsequently making changes if pacing is off? I'm just curious, like how you think about that, because on my end, I talk with many businesses as we kind of audit them and whatnot on the Aplo side, and you have some people that are very much in the camp of we need to be making changes daily if there's anything off against our pacing versus our forecast. You have other people that look at it more on a 3 or 7 day basis. I think what's very important here is taking into consideration your purchasing cycle as a brand. How long does it typically take somebody from the time they see your ad to actually, subsequently purchasing from you? Because that's going to have big impacts on the paid acquisition side. Like, let's say you have a 3 day, or let's say, well, it's 7 days as an example, from the time somebody sees an ad to typically when they purchase. If you make a change one day, you might not see the result from that actual change that you made until potentially 7 days later, and how that actually impacts that kind of
Yeah, I think I know the
bucket of
point you're
customers
trying.
that are coming through. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I think I know the point you're trying to make. If I could make like one rule that would work for probably 90% of brands, and again, it's not gonna work for 100, but like for nine, like I
yeah,
would say plan monthly, adjust weekly, and reference daily, something like that. That would
yeah.
probably
I
be
like that.
a good framework. And the reason is like when you're adjusting things every single day, like again, depends on your goals, depends on the severity of the pacing lag. Like for example, if something is truly going wrong, you want to make that adjustment as quickly as possible. If there's like tremendous evidence that things are just going sideways and it's clear something is wrong. But if it's something that's not actually proven out and you don't know if this is like a thing that's material or if it's just, for example, 1 day fluctuation, well, fluctuations do happen. That's part of the noise. So you do need to have enough sort of kind of consistent signal to understand like, okay, well, like, was this just a fluctuation or is there something actually more dramatically wrong? So typically having a little bit more data, and if we want to use like a really nice round number, like just using like a weekly kind of goalpost is probably okay. But you do want to be referencing these things in real time as well. You don't want to just be looking at it once a month or once a quarter. Um,
Yep.
Again, some brands are very fortunate. They're in a position where they, maybe 1 month or 1 quarter things look so great that like, whatever you do seems to be working really, really well. But typically over time, that ends up compounding into misses on a forecasting side, misses on inventory planning. There's a lot of downstream implications to not having like a forecasting exercise in
Yep.
place. So, plan monthly at minimum, reference your forecast daily, and make adjustments either weekly or as quickly as needed based on the severity of the impact or the thing
Yeah.
going wrong or right. Like you
Yeah.
could be in a situation where like we have this opportunity right now to really push because things are going much better than we thought, and we actually have more inventory on hand than we can actually support this level of efficiency. And if things go really, really well, you also want to have scenarios planned for that. So again, it's not just looking at downside risk. There's also upside potential unlocked when you do forecasting properly and when you reference it on a regular basis. So um,
Yep.
yeah, I would say that.
Well said, well said. And I like your framing at the end too about the upside and downside scenario with forecasting. You're not just again unlocking the ability to kind of have foresight into a downside scenario and what you need to do to adjust if that's where you're pacing, but you're also unlocking the ability to understand what that upside might look like and when you can push more aggressively. So I thought that was really good. Um, Forecast versus actual. I think we basically touched on that in the last slide there. I'll say one thing here. Typically, how we do this for kind of more of a macro planning perspective is we'll usually look at the forecast versus the actual for the previous month in the first week of the next month to really understand what do we hit, what do we miss, do we need to adjust anything over this this next month period in order to course correct based off of what happened the previous month. And last thing too, it is an imperfect game. I think that's again a very important concept to grasp when you talk about forecasting is that all forecasts have some variance. The goal is to trigger decision making and prepare for different potential outcomes. That's really what it is. And one thing we'll also say here is we get exposure to working with a lot of different organization structures. Some teams have an internal finance department, CFOs, fractional CFOs, internal marketing, external marketing, vastly different organization structures. But the one common theme that I think is very important across all of those structures is the best forecasting happens when you have a growth marketing team or somebody overseeing the actual activities and initiatives on the growth marketing channels, really driving the initial forecast because they're the ones that have a lot of context into the marketing calendar, what they're expecting to see, any offers they're launching throughout the month, whatever it may be. And that kind of really sets the tone of what the initial forecast and expectation is. And then you have that kind of gut checked against the finance team from a cash flow perspective if there's anything that needs to be changed to meet some sort of cash flow requirements that they have, et cetera. So that's what we see work best. Would encourage you guys to do the same as you build this out internally and ensure that every single piece of those, or every single kind of department is on the same page, but the initial kind of forecast really should be led by the growth marketing team because they have a lot of impact into what that actually and what that end outcome actually becomes. Um, we'll go to Q&A really quickly here, a bit over time, so I'll give it a quick 30 seconds to see if anybody has any questions. If not, we'll proceed to the next slide where we'll talk a little bit about the offer that everybody will be getting here for joining, and then we'll wrap things up. But we'll give it a quick 30 seconds here. If you have any questions, there's the QA chat bot that you can open up. Okay, doesn't look like we have any at the moment, so we'll keep going. But again, so thank you all for attending and registering. As we talked a lot about here, there's a ton of different components that go into making a proper forecast. We know this firsthand. If you're building out this out statically in spreadsheets, it can get very messy over time. If there's an error, something's displaying incorrectly, it can sink a lot of time trying to figure out what's going on there, and gut checking it. So if you want to do this on autopilot, everybody here that attended gets 45 days free of Alan, which is our demand planning and forecasting tool that we built internally. So anybody here that would like to try that out will get 45 days free. I'll send a follow-up email afterwards with the code that you can enter to unlock that. And you can autopilot the entire forecasting initiative that we talked about on the presentation today. So again, appreciate everybody coming on. Jacob, anything else on your end before we wrap up?
All good on my end.
Awesome. Perfect. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.